Perfect. So I'm very, very sorry for the technical issues that we've had. In any case, now let me start once more. Buona tarde a todos, buenas tardes, good evening, and a very warm welcome. And as I said now already several times, it gives me really great pleasure to moderate today's session and to introduce to you a prolific and very interesting speaker. And tonight we're fortunate to be able to welcome Dr. Paola Rivetti, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Dublin City University. Dr. Rivetti has been writing, publishing, and speaking on the Islamic Republic of Iran, but also the wider Middle East and North Africa region. And she has done so in an impressive number of languages. Dr. Rivetti has also carried out extensive fieldwork in the region, so she's very knowledgeable of the region by her own experience. Her research focuses primarily on the government of societies and polities from a comparative perspective, as well as on social and political mobilizations, migration in and from the region, public policy, as well as gender and sexuality. However, Dr. Rivetti's activities are not only focused on academia, but transcended. She's an active contributor to also to controversial public issues, and she's involved in a range of different cultural organizations. She's also the member of the advisory board of the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies, a representative for scholars at risk at Dublin University, or Dublin City University, and a member of the Council of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. In addition, she's a co-founding member of the Irish Network for MENA Studies, an associate editor for the journal Iranian Studies, and a member of the editorial board of the journal Participazione e Conflitti and the blog Lavoro Culturale. Furthermore, she's a member of the board for the book series Mediterraneo, North Africa, e Medio Oriente for the publisher Mimesis. And she also led the Erasmus Plus International Credit Mobility Exchange with Bethlehem University, apart from being a member on numerous advisory boards for a range of different research projects. So this clearly shows her wide range of activities and interests. And coming back to publications, I also would like to introduce you her publications as co-editor. This includes Islamists and the Politics of the Arab Uprisings, Governance, Pluralization and Contention, published by Edinburgh University Press. And also another book called Continuity and Change Before and After the Arab Uprisings, Morocco, Tunisia and Egypt, published by Routledge. However, today, the session is connected to her latest book, which has just been published or recently been published by Palgrave, and it bears the same title as today's session, and that is Political Participation in Iran from Khatami to the Green Movement. Dr. Rivetti is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and this is followed by a Q&A session. And I would like to encourage you already now to place your questions in the provided boxes, that is the Q&A box here on Zoom and also the chat box on YouTube. You may do so in English, Spanish, or even Italian if you wish. And please keep your questions as short and concise as possible. However, we're very much looking forward to receiving them. So again, we are very excited to having you here with us tonight, Paola. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction. I'm really honored to be part of the speaker series of the IEMed, of the Institute for the Mediterranean in Barcelona. So it's really a great honor for me to be here. I'm really happy. The only very small detail that makes me sad is that I'm not able to be there with you, in person and enjoy, Barcelona in May as well. It's something that saddens me, but, I'm sure we will be able to do this in person very soon. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides that will help me to keep the time, but also to going through what I would like to talk about tonight. So as Olivia kindly mentioned, the talk will be mostly about my latest work. That's a book that was published last year by Palgrave. It's titled Political Participation in Iran, from Khatami to the Green Movement. And what I would like to do tonight is not exclusively telling you about the content of the book, but I would like to do something slightly different, and also revealing, if you want, the logical and the kind of process, the mental process that led me to think about the issue of political participation in Iran in this specific period in a specific way, and therefore making this, literally inspiring, if you want, my approach, and that's the approach that you would find in the book, my approach to the study of political participation in Iran from Khatami to the Green Movement. So, and I want to do this not only because it's, I think it's always interesting to kind of get into the mind and the head of researchers to kind of understand how they reason and how they think and why they get to understand reality in a specific way, but also because every researcher, in every book, in every article we write and we publish, there is something about us. So very much the starting point is, is myself. And this is also, as you know, a feminist approach that, I start with myself. Because this is relevant to the research. So what was the beginning? So I am very much a child of post 9/11 period. I was born in the 80s, so I would say that the two of the most important events that really had an impact on my biography, on my way of thinking about politics, my way of thinking about the world, have been the collapse of the Soviet Union in '89, although I was a child back then. And when I was an adult, I was in the first year of university, 9/11. So the 9/11 was really something, important, and was really something that kind of drove my interest towards the region, towards this place that was mostly unknown to. Was not unknown, but possibly policymakers and opinion makers, journalists, and even the academics in part, didn't actually have the word to, or the right language to kind of talk about it. So I got very much interested, and I really wanted to understand what happened and why, above all, that happened. And this, of course, was very much in line with my interest in international relations and international politics. And of course, researchers are social animals. So we think about the world because we are exposed to a specific discourse and, a public discourse about the world. The way in which the public even intellectual discourse was thinking about the 9/11 and was thinking about the attacks on the Twin Towers was very much in terms of this dichotomy between Islam on the one side, a kind of uniform, a kind of never-changing system of political thought, system of values, really a way of life on the one side, and on the other side, democracy as, again, uniform, frozen in time, and very much a way of life instead of a way of organizing societies and thinking about power. And of course, Islam and democracy were put in opposition, were two opposed poles. And the question that everybody was repeating and repeating over and over when thinking about 9/11 and how can we understand 9/11 was very much the question of, are Islam and democracy compatible? You know, and today we still have that question in the public, in public discourse, in like TV talk shows, and intellectuals might still ask that question. But today we know that Islam is not uniform. What kind of Islam are you thinking about, or you're talking about when you think of Islam as non-compatible or compatible with democracy? So we know things are much more complex than a question that requires that you can answer yes or no. But still, this question is part of the of the public discourse. I cannot I cannot ignore or overlook that what is happening in Palestine, Israel these days. And at least in Italy, I'm connecting from Italy. I am in Italy at this moment. At least in Italy, the narrative that is dominating the public debate is very much this idea that this is a war between Hamas and Israel. And of course, this narrative is extremely problematic, doesn't really capture what's going on the ground. But we do have the resurgence of this idea of Islam, and therefore Hamas is a kind of natural enemy to democracy. So this question has changed with time, but still is quite crucial to how in Europe especially we think about politics in the region. So of course I didn't have all the instruments that I have today for kind of criticizing this approach to Islam and democracy and asking whether these two are compatible. So I was very much into this question. I was very much paying attention to whether these two are compatible or not. And one answer to the question was offered actually by something that I got really interested in, and that was Islamic Reformism. So Islamic Reformism was this idea that actually, what was an idea with intellectual and epistemological credibility and legitimacy. I'm not trying to, to say that, but, every time that we had this question in the public discourse, there always was someone saying that, yes, they are compatible because there is something that is called Islamic Reformism. And therefore, we don't have to think of Islam on the one side and democracy on the other side as these two opposing and incompatible poles, okay? And it is not coincidence that in those years, so after 9/11, but actually since late 90s already, so it kind of precedes a little bit the attack on the Twin Towers, we did have scholars that were publishing about this, this topic. And you have here, just two of the two covers of two quite famous books from that time that were, we're talking about precisely about this topic. So the first one, as you can see, is called Reformist Voices of Iran. And look at the subtitle, Mediating. So Islamic Reformism is a mediation, is a bridge, mediating Islam and democracy. And you had, you always had Islam and something. Sometimes it was democracy, sometimes it was modernity, as you can see in on this cover. But, there was always the presupposition that you had this, that this was the way of thinking, the right way of thinking about, about Islam and about politics, largely speaking, in the region. So what was Islamic Reformism about? It was basically about, a reinterpretation of Islam and Sharia, a reinterpretation that was liberal, at times was what was called liberal Islam instead of reformist Islam, was democratic, was modern. And what's this idea that this more modern reinterpretation of Islam and Sharia would have made them compatible with modern values, with democracy and human rights. And you have here some, the covers of some books which were important and were actually, dissecting and also supporting okay, this idea of reinterpretation. But a very interesting article, look at the date when it was published, 2003. Okay, so this is, it's just 2 years after 9/11. An article published in the Journal of Democracy, which was a journal where all these debates were actually taking place, by a Moroccan-French scholar, Filali Ansari, who are precisely, talking about what is liberal Islam, the sources of enlightened Muslim thought. Okay, so this idea of modernity, this idea of enlightenment, this idea of liberalism. You also had other buzzwords, such as, for instance, civil society. So this idea that you might have, dictators at the top, but you also have a population that doesn't necessarily buy or doesn't necessarily agree with dictatorship, and that is called civil society. Another buzzword was, or more than a buzzword, another very important aspects and characteristic of Islamic Reformism and the political discourse around it, was the idea that Islam was in the middle of a transition, and Islamic Reformism, a transition to democracy, and Islamic Reformism was of great importance in kind of helping this transition, in kind of making this transition happen, so that Islam was, compatible and actually very much helping modern values, democracy, and human rights. The interesting thing is that at the core of all these ideas was the assumption that Islam was in crisis. And this wasn't a very common idea. And the interesting bit is that very often it was not clear what was the difference between Islam as a religion or I don't know, or for instance, the Moroccan monarchy as a political system, or even, a country or a society. So what was exactly, was it a cultural crisis? Was it a political crisis? All of these things were overlapping, okay? And Islamic Reformism was also transnational discourse. So you didn't, it was really a big idea, a very strong and solid and consolidated intellectual tradition that you would have in many different parts of the world, not necessarily the Middle East and North Africa, because of course you would have Muslims all over the world. So you had many different intellectuals who were Muslims. Perhaps they had, origins from the region, from some countries in the region, but who were living in France, in Spain, in Italy, or Germany, and we're actually contributing to this discussion. So you have here some, the pictures of some important people. So let's start from this is the right, let's start from right. So you have Abu Bakr, who's for instance, who was the director of the Great Mosque in Paris, so based in France. Filali Ansari, we already mentioned him. You possibly have seen already and know who that lady is, Fatima Mernissi, possibly the most important intellectual and Islamic feminist who passed away, recently. And she really was a, intellectually speaking, she's a giant. She's really a very important, monumental figure in the intellectual elaboration of this idea that we have compatibility, and it's all about reinterpretation and interpretation of sacred sources. And very similarly, the last two pictures are of two Iranian, although not Iran-based, or two Iranian intellectual, Ziba Mirosseini, who's also another very important intellectual and scholar of Islamic feminism. And in the upper, just above Mirosseini, we have Abdul Karim Soroush, who's another very important philosopher. And he really made of this idea of reinterpretation the core of his intellectual production. So I was showing you pictures of different people from different parts of the world to actually to actually give you the idea of how transnational, okay, this discourse was from Europe to somebody like Fatima Mernissi, who was living between France and Morocco, to Iran. So you had many different, people contributing to this dialogue. And it was really, I mean, I was really an enthusiastic. It was really something that, was extremely, I feel extremely grateful, because it was very interesting to see how all these voices combined and, spoke to each other. And of course, you did have an Iranian variation of Islamic Reformism, okay, which had many, the same characteristics that we just discussed. So the centrality of civil society, the idea that there will be a transition to democracy, the idea that we have to reinterpret the sacred sources to make them compatible with liberalism, democracy, and human rights. You had all of that. But of course, you also had specificity, because we're talking about Iran. So all those different characteristics were, were kind of localized into a specific place, and rather specific, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. So let's see, what Islamic Reformism was about in Iran. So we have the beginning, very much the start of discussions about Islamic Reformism in Iran after 1989. Why? Because in 1989, as you know, there's the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has implications for the Islamic Republic as well. But when it comes to Iran, we have the end of the war with Iraq, and we also have the death of the Imam Khomeini. So there is a certain sense, and scholars capture this feeling by talking about Iran at the crossroads. This idea of crossroads becomes really, really common in the scholarship. So there is a feeling that after 1989, Iran can decide whether the Islamic Republic, can decide whether it still wants to remain kind of on the same track, or if it wants to embrace modernity and, of course, not liberalism, but, values of modernity and values of democracy, and therefore, moving towards Islamic liberalism. So, and the discourse, the language that is being used around this very important moment is, as I said, is all about this idea of crossroads. And again, we have, these dichotomies that are again presented. So it's a crossroad between what? Between modernity and tradition, between Islam and democracy. So this is the language that is being used. And again, it is the same language that we just mentioned being used for Islamic Reformism. So it is in the 90s that we have, the beginning, the start of this language, of this discourse about the Islamic Republic in Iran as well. Of course, it's not only about, scholars living elsewhere writing about Iran, but this is something that was happening in Iran. So we have the beginning, the birth of Iran's reform movement, which actually becomes really important to the point that in 1997, so towards the end of the 90s, we have the election of this man whose name is Mohammad Khatami, who becomes president of the Republic, and he is at the elms. He is the leader of something that is called Jombesh Eslah Talaban, so the movement of the reformists. So we have political power in the hands of this movement of the reformists. We have a name, so people who would self-define and look at themselves as a group. Okay, so it becomes a reality. And the younger me, of course, was looking at this with great interest. I mean, in '97, I wasn't in university yet, but so actually I got interested in this perhaps in 2000, 2003, 2004, so some years later. But Iran, I got interested in Iranian reformism precisely because it was the perfect symbol in my head, in my perception, was the perfect symbol, the embodiment of everything I was interested in. And I wanted to understand, okay? And we also had this idea of the transition to democracy in the Islamic Republic of Iran, which actually was quite common among reformists, although it was quite dangerous because the non-reformist part of the elite really didn't like it, because it really sounded like, regime change, colored revolution, and all of that. So they really didn't like it. But it was quite common in reality among reformists, and really was in line with another idea that was really common among reformists. And the idea was that reformism was an important step in this kind of trajectory from dictatorship to freedom and democracy that Iran was going through. So reformism was really thought thought of by the population with this kind of great expectations, and to me it was really, really interesting. So it was very interesting, but I was also very frustrated because I didn't want to study Iran as everybody else was doing, therefore talking about the crossroads, and therefore talking about the opposition between Islam and democracy, or Islam and modernity, or saying that reformists were so nice and they would have helped and make this transition to democracy happen. So I didn't know how to go beyond this kind of flat narrative, okay, kind of very linear narrative of reformism as inherently good and positive for the country. So I decided to focus on the contradictions. And political participation ended up being the object, if you want, I focused on. Because on the one side, political participation was promoted by Khatami's governments. Khatami's government's rhetoric was all about civil society and human rights and democracy and political participation. You even had one of the most important political parties named after political participation. However, on the other side, what did happen on the ground in reality, and I started to travel back and forth between Iran and Italy in 2005. So what I was actually seeing in Iran was that in reality, social movements were repressed with the consent of the government. So it was not the conservative, it was not the hardliners only who were repressing social movements, but most of the time, very often, the reformist government, that same government that was asking people to become politically active, was consenting to repression. So for me, this was, when I put this in focus, to me, it was really the starting point, of asking, a number of questions to myself, such as, for instance, how to make sense of the government calling for political participation, but also repressing it. How to make sense of this contradiction. Is it only the typical contradiction between reality and rhetoric, or is there something else? And actually there was something else. So it was not only, about something we are very much used, and that's the fact that governments make a lot of promises but don't deliver. It was not only about this, but was much more. So as I said, so I will just focus on one example for the sake of time, but I can elaborate on this in the Q&A, and I'm actually happy to do so. So the contradiction, you had this contradiction between the promotion of civil society, but also repression of civil society, that is NGOs and social movements. You had repression of street protests with the consent of the government, and even those protests and actions that actually were in support of the government. And perhaps a very telling example, and this is very famous, so you might have heard of this, is the 1999 student protest, where you had students actually taken to the streets and protesting because they felt the government was being attacked by the hardliners and the conservatives. So it was students who in Iran are a very important political constituency because they do represent this kind of revolutionary subject. Okay, so they are very much sought, they are very much looked after and cared about by the government. So they were taken to the streets in support of the government, and yet Khatami's government betrayed them. And and reading documents and making interviews, and that was my kind of the methodology I use the most, but also reading through the different memories and articles that were written about it, about the protest movement, became clear that there was, and also comparing this incident, if you want, of the 99 protest movement with other examples and incidents of repression with the consent of the government, it became clear that there was a pattern. It was intentional. There was an intentional pattern, and that was about excluding, if not outright repressing, social or political actors, NGOs, social movements that were perceived by the government as too radical. So the government wanted people to become politically active. The government wanted people to participate politically, but only as the government told them to do so. So the government had very, very clear in its mind, if a government has a mind, but in its plan, there were very clear limitations to that political participation, to that political activism, and so forth and so on. So anybody who was overstepping those limitations was repressed with the consent, of course, of the government. So instead of thinking of reformism as this kind of step in the process of democratization, I started to see reformism as a disciplinary project, as a system of political discourse, rhetoric, but also policies and laws that the government was proposing to the parliament and the parliament was passing, that were about disciplining the population into what? Into a way of thinking about change and the way of pursuing change. The only change Iranians could think of, according to the government, was reform. It was not revolution. It was not radical political imagination. It was not about smashing patriarchy, capitalism, and racism. No, it was about moderation, and it was about reform. Okay, and there was just one way to attain that reform, and it was not through radical political action. It was through reform. So reform was this kind of really uninspiring, at the end of the day, really non-imaginative, really non-creative political utopia that the government was forcing on the population, okay? And this, of course, had consequences because, the government was asking people to activate and participate politically, which the people did. But then the government wanted to have the last word about how people became active. And a lot of people didn't like it. A lot of people didn't accept. a lot of people, you know, activated politically and started to, you know, to establish NGOs, to participate in social movement and so forth and so on, and actually realize that they wanted much more than reformism. So there is a sort of, you know, paradox here. There is a sort of short circuit, something that I called the unintended consequences, the unwanted consequences. And that is the fact that the reformist government ended up building a civil society that they hoped to have in control, but in reality didn't have in control. And that's why repression, violent repression, was so important, because it was the only, you know, it was the only way, if you want, of you know, of still maintaining control on a extremely lively and extremely imaginative population that wanted much more and were not happy with the, you know, small results that the reformist government was giving to them. So this is why I talk about unintended consequences in the book, and I use this, you know, this idea, this concept, if you want, which is quite, I mean, this is not my own. It's being used by other scholars before me. But something also that I, you know, that if you want, these are the consequences of these unintended consequences, is that, you know, people who, those who wanted more than reformism, you know, were repressed. A lot of them were arrested, but it's not like, you know, they disappeared, and even repressive action could 100% eradicate their thinking, or, you know, that thinking from society. So what happened is that the failure of this disciplinary action on political imagination and on political action produced what I called a surplus of activism. So a sort of, you know, a surplus. So it was the demands, but also the actual activist networks and the actual people, you know, I met and who were meeting amongst themselves and organizing political action and political things, who were excluded by the government because they were too radical. You know, a lot of time they were repressed, but still, you know, stayed around, remained around, didn't disappear. Okay, and what I argue in the book and try to show as well through empirical research, is that that surplus of activism, which was about ideas, which was about demands, which was about real people, actually is the background, is the you know, the fertile ground from which the Green Movement could, you know, could blossom, could spur. Without the work of those excluded, repressed, too radical activists, we wouldn't have had a Green Movement. So for those who don't know what the Green Movement was this massive protest movement that took place in Iran in 2009, after Ahmadinejad was elected for a second time, and the vast majority of Iranians, or perhaps they were not the vast majority, that doesn't really matter, were convinced that the election were stolen. There was an electoral fraud, and therefore, you know, took to the street. So, and the power. And those protests lasted for months and months and months, becoming more and more radical day by the day. So without that surplus of activism, that frustration that survived Khatami sanctioned repression, we wouldn't have had the kind of the network, the social and political capital that made the Green Movement possible. So to sum up, and then concluding, and I think I want to say it goes well with what I want to say about methodology. So my argument, so I started researching for this book in 2005. This book was published in 2020. So it's 15 years of, pain. No, I'm joking. It's 15 years of, of questioning myself, of questioning what I see, and so forth and so on. And it's been 15 years of going back and forth between Italy and Iran first, and then after I moved to Ireland, between Ireland and Iran. And I think this shows in the book because I have been able to see how things and how activists have reacted to different type of governments, but also different types of authoritarian politics under different leaders, and to see how this has developed across the across basically 2 decades. Sorry, 1 decade. And I could link the two, the Khatami's government, which started at the end of the 90s, and the Green Movement, which took place at the end of the 2000s. Okay, so without this kind of long going back and forth, I wouldn't have been able to observe these changes, across all these years. And I was also able to go kind of beyond the state of the art and really not reproducing what I was reading. Okay, so usually what you read about Iran is there's always something about Islam. I don't even talk about Islam in my book. That's, to talk about Italy, you don't need to know about Catholicism. I mean, many people in Italy don't care about it, and it's important, but do decentralize religion. So I was able to do that. I was able to decentralize institutions as well, because I was focusing on activists. But I hope I didn't romanticize social movements, which is something that I really hope I didn't do. I was able to bring in race, class, and gender. I didn't talk about it in the presentation. I can talk more about this in the Q&A. But I was able to see how, for instance, what type of activism, and the demands, political demands of activism vary depending on, for instance, what class you're from. And this is something that is not really talked about when it comes to the region. We tend, especially from Europe or the USA, we tend to see the region as this kind of class. There's always something about Islam, and it's kind of classless, exotic place. And of course, I was able to write something different from this kind of millenaristic idea or approach to reformism, which understands reformism as this step in the long march of Iran towards from dictatorship to liberty and freedom, by thinking about reformism as a disciplinary project, as a as not as something that is about liberty, but actually as something that is about political constraining. I want to stop here, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen as well. And thank you. And I'm very much looking forward to questions or comments or anything you want to share with me.
Great, that was very inspiring. Thank you so much, Paola. That was really excellent. I think very thought-provoking and super interesting, not only to hear about the content, but also, your personal journey within your research. I very much appreciate, also that you positioned yourself and how you came to your research and how you went about it. So once more, I want to reiterate to everyone wherever you're joining us from, you may place your questions on Zoom in the Q&A box, or if you're joining on YouTube, you can also place your questions there. don't hesitate to do so. If you feel more comfortable not doing this in English, but in Spanish or even in Italian, please feel free to do so. And please try to be as short and concise as possible. Once you're typing sometimes, then it can get quite long. So if you don't mind, I'll take the privilege to ask a few questions first. I have a few lined up. I'll start with one. So because generally now you have been talking about reformism, and you have also kind of presented here Khatami, especially in his capacity as embodying the reformist movement. And I think to this day, he is in fact the only true reformist, particularly reformist president, if you want to say. However, could we illuminate this diversity a little bit for the audience as well, maybe to understand the pluralism in the political landscape, because sometimes that is portrayed as a monolithic landscape, right? And where everyone is the same. And we should also come back to that question because, you know, despite the diversity, you know, the reformists and the pragmatists and the conservative, I mean, however you want to call them, right? If you want to have only the split in binaries, the moderates and the conservatives, or if you want to be more detailed, then, you know, pragmatists and reformists, and some say neoconservatives, etc., etc. And then the question, though, is there a difference? Because, you know, now also people have elections are coming up in Iran in June. So again, of course, the political debate is very much alive. Candidates are debating, are putting forward their proposals. So, and civil society seems to be extremely disenchanted, the population extremely enchanted, saying there's a choice, we have no choice, all is the same.
Yeah, thanks Olivia for the question. This actually, yeah, thanks for it, because it is actually helped me clarify, you know, what the hell am I talking about? Politics in Iran change, and exactly as you know, I often think about Iran through other countries, and this really helps me to de-exceptionalize, orientalize the region in Iran. So Iran, exactly like Italy, for instance, in the past, say, 20 years, has been shifting towards the right. You know, towards a politics which is less liberal, more illiberal, and more authoritarian, both in terms of the policies, but also in terms of the political forces. So while, you know, 20 years ago, when I was doing this research, we still had this cleavage between reformists, who were the quasi-liberal on the one side, and on the other side, you had the conservatives, who were, you know, more conservative, and therefore, you know, were really suspicious of all this talk about human rights and democracy and so forth and so on. And it was a very clear cleavage, rhetorically speaking, but also the policies that the Khatami's government tried to pass, like freedom of speech and freedom of the press in particular, you know, were very distinct. After Khatami, and especially after Ahmadinejad, who represented, you know, who represented a populist right, we did have a reorganization of the political landscape, especially on the right, because Ahmadinejad, you know, a lot of people on the right and a lot of political forces on the right really didn't like Ahmadinejad. So there was many were into these efforts of distinguishing themselves from this very populist rightist leader. Okay, so what we have today is basically, you know, a very diverse and strong right, an extremely weak, I would say, what is called Islamic left, or even Islamic center left. So I'll give you an example. So Rouhani, who's the current incumbent president of the Republic, embodies very much a technocratic reformism. So he knows that some policy sectors need reform, and he wants to do the reforms, but this is not about imagining what we want. This is not about imagining, this is not about pursuing, this is not about politics as the art of the impossible, as the daring art of radical reimagining power and our society, not at all. Rouhani has a very technocratic approach. His idea of reform and reformism is about the politics of the possible. So it's different from Khatami's time, because Khatami, I think, was able to inspire more the population. But today, nobody is excited about reformism. As you said, there's a lot of disenchantment. There's a lot of disillusionment, and I think they're right. I think I would be part of the disillusion if I were Iranian. It's very difficult to be inspired today by any of the political anything on the political market in Iran. And do they differ? Is there a difference? So yes and no. No, because every political force has to abide to very clear political limitation. There are things you can say, there are things you can do, and there are things you just can't even imagine doing. Like for instance, saying that the principle, the core principle of the Islamic Republic, which is a political religious principle, should be repealed, and we should think of another principle for establishing for the constitution, for instance. But I think there is very little difference. But I don't think this is because of such constitutional differences. Principles. There are very little differences, exactly as we have very little differences in our European countries between what we call the left and what we call the right. So this kind of convergence, which is both ideological convergence, but it's also policy convergence. Saying that I don't know about Spain, I'm sorry, but in places like Italy or Ireland, defending public education and defending the public health system is something really radical. I mean, which is quite surprising if we think that it didn't used to be this radical. So I think the convergence we have is because of that.
Yeah, exactly, and it fits a little bit in what you told before. In fact, having maybe using the word emancipated, right? A very able, emancipated society. So I guess that goes right back to that. We have a few questions from the audience, and I would like to start with one that was quite intriguing as well, because one of the participants says, I wish you had talked a little bit more about the class issue, especially in connection to the 2005 and 2009 elections.
Yeah, so class, so definitely, I mean, perhaps I start talking about how class got into my work, because this is connected. So the first time I went to Iran and I started, this long journey was in 2005. And I remember meeting with, with people I had contact with before, and then I got other contacts and so forth and so on. So they all were I mean, they were the people that a non-Farsi speaking fresh person to Iran can get access to. So they were all they were all professionals in liberal professions. So I remember at the very beginning, I was very much spending time with architects and engineers, university professors, and then I got more. After a while, I got into the NGO world and journalist world and so forth and so on. So they were all middle class or low middle class people, the majority of them, of course. And to me, it was very interesting because I remember a lot of people repeating to me that, Ahmadinejad might have won elections, but he's stupid. The kind of collective intelligence of Iranians is too forward for him, and and we will basically, we're very much dismissing him, and this was interesting for me because cogitating and thinking about why that was the case, what was the meaning of all those things that were told to me. Of course, there was a political judgment on the person. And I mean, if you listen to Ahmadinejad's speeches, you might think that he's not very brilliant, right? He was saying a lot of, inaccuracies and mistaken information and so forth and so on. But there was also class dimension to this. Not because Ahmadinejad is the hero of the poor, as he liked to depict himself, but precisely because he was projecting that image, right? And this issue of class was coming, over and over, all the time was coming back. And to me, it was very interesting, for instance, also to see how, for instance, in the context of of another very famous campaign, which was called 1 Million Signatures, you would have, class layers, and you would see how feminists and activists from working class backgrounds, were enthusiastically participating in the campaign, but were also very much aware of the fact that changing the law would have not changed their material conditions of life. While on the other side, talking to, for instance, the many lawyers who were involved in the campaign and who were coming from a middle class or low middle class background, they really placed a lot of emphasis on the law, and this was another indication of how class plays into into the way in which people, for instance, set political priorities. So what is your priority? Is it changing the law, or is it changing the power relationships between those who produce and those who own the means of production? And these were very important indications. And when it comes to the Green Movement, of course, class was really important. I mean, I'm not the only one to have studied this. The fact that the Green Movement wasn't able to extend its reach beyond, beyond again liberal demands. And there was this great opportunity of calling for a national strike, which wasn't called for. So, all these problems, all these problems were obstacles in the formation of a cross-class, cross-ideological coalitions, which are needed for kind of more revolutionary, radical political change, and which we have seen years after in Tunisia and in Egypt and so forth and so on. So I can talk more, but if you want to know something more, specific, I'm happy to.
Perfect, thank you. We have a couple of topics, I guess, that not necessarily are related, but we should bring in. First, I would say let's have a look at the idea of nationalism, maybe in this context. One of the participants would like to know what, in your opinion, are the main layers of nationalism. Is there a generational cleavage? And is it growing? Is that structural within Iranian society?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm not a great expert of Iranian nationalism. I can point you out to people who know much more and have published on the specific topic. But again, nationalism, nationalism is what people make of nationalism. And that there was at a certain point during Khatami's period, there were all these discussions about, Iran for all Iranians, which were very important because they were, I think, they really resembled the beginning of a serious conversation about, Persian supremacy and nationalism, and this idea that Iran, to be Iranian and to be a nationalist or a patriot, there are certain characteristics that you should have. So there was an attempt at doing that, which I haven't really cogitated or thought a lot about. But definitely, to be honest, I don't buy very much into this idea of nationalism as the opposite. If this kind of, again, binary between nationalism and Islam, and and if you believe in a kind of lay idea of nationalism, then you would have issues with believing in, I don't know, in feeling belonging to. I'm not really sure it works. I don't know if I answered your question. When it comes to generational cleavages, I think it's, like any society, intergenerational conflicts are really important and are really structure a lot of things, culturally speaking, but also materially speaking. Exactly as like in many other countries. I always try to de-exceptionalize Iran. I don't know if you noticed that, but I always, I was like, it happens in many other countries. But definitely, I'm sure you're familiar with the expression boomers. Of course, you have Iranian boomers, exactly as you have, boomers from everywhere else in the world. And I have encountered a lot of intergenerational conflicts in my work. And a lot of them were, were precisely about the unequal material distribution of the benefits of post-revolutionary economy and politics. And interestingly enough, this was especially so in the context of, charities and NGOs, where you would have a a revolutionary generation very much at the, in positions of power, and really it's very difficult for a younger generation that enters the job market and wants to, and wants to turn voluntarism and volunteering into an actual job to get paid for that. And this creates a lot of conflict. So definitely, generational cleavages are definitely structural and, couldn't be different.
Yeah, exactly. With very different hopes and aspirations, right? Growing up in a very different context, and
yes, definitely. And also, I didn't mention that. Thanks for reminding me of that. Definitely, there are also in terms of the kind of cultural references, of course, are different. But also the way, we were talking about before. I was talking about before about reformism as the art of the possible. Politics as the art of the possible versus politics as the art of the impossible. So politics is something that really can inspire you, right? So the younger generation is less shy, if you want, in saying that politics as the art of the possible has a lot of problems and a lot of limitations, and we should not be afraid of looking for inspiration in other venues if kind of institutional politics doesn't inspire us. I think my generation, I didn't mention that, as a person born in the 80s, I was actually doing work and research with people from my age, from my generation. I think people from my generation in Iran felt a lot of more responsibility in abiding in seeking change, but within a structure, in seeking change, but within limitation. Okay, I think the younger generation, know that it is impossible. It's already been tried. So.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a more of a, I guess now it's the time where there you alluded to during Khatami's time, this I don't want to call it excitement, right? But the positive atmosphere, and I guess this is not what we're saying today. I would like to speak to you de-exceptionalizing Iran, making comparisons, and
sorry, Olivia, for interrupting. Can I answer the first questions? I don't know if you saw them. There are two questions by
Sohail. Definitely.
Yeah, no, Sohail, thanks very much for mentioning this. This is actually very important. Yes, I tend, when I present the book, I tend to, not to downplay this because it's not important, but I tend to focus on the other part just because it's more new. I mean, but you're right. Part of the reason, the short circuit I was talking about before, so the government calling on people to participate and calling on people to activate politically, was also motivated by this threat coming from those who were not reformists, the conservatives. So those who have, as you wrote, more power than because they were. Of course, they still are, controlling some institutions or parts of the constitutional building, so to say, that have actual, even military force and power. So yeah, definitely. Thanks for mentioning it. But actually, when it comes to the 1999 protest, actually it was calling, Karoubi called for the repression of the protest. So that is a very good example to show how difficult and how contradictory, if you want, the relationship between the government and social movement was. You have a social movement taken to the street, basically in your support, but then you get scared because they continue in protesting, and therefore you actively call for their repression. And this, of course, goes very well, and it's in line with with the action of the conservative forces, which are already ready to repress them. But yeah, but I think the Khatami's government has a lot of responsibility, like any government. Talking about the exceptionalizing.
Yeah, exactly. Because on the one hand, of course, while there's these different forces and while there's all these differences, nonetheless, right, what you said, there is a responsibility. I mean, there's no absolution from that. But I guess here, this is what here the participant also was asking for a little bit, that there, this distinction between the government and
okay, yeah, sorry, I didn't see.
And I get, he says particularly, I read it so that everybody can hear it. I feel like the very clear and still present distinction between the administration and the whole government wasn't clarified, and government was used interchangeably to mean Khatami's administration and the whole political apparatus.
Yeah, so governments are, there are some ministers who are nominated, formally or less formally by the Supreme Leader, for instance, and the presidents of the Republic, although they, constitutionally have the executive power, they are elected, and also they represent the executive power. So they constitutionally, are those who form the government, accept that. So there are, there are, especially in very important ministers, such as Minister of Information, for instance, are not under the control, or are not contribute, or not collaborating, are not part of the political project that the people voted for, and the President of the Republic is there to implement. So yeah, that's correct.
Thank you very much for the clarification. It was great. And then moving on to a different type of context a little bit. We have another question or curiosity, which links the beginning of your conference, of your talk, with some current affairs. And the question is, what is your view on Macron stating that Islam needs to be reformed? And what would be your opinion on the very widespread vision that reforming Islam would be the solution to preventing radicalization?
Thank you. I wasn't aware. I don't know if I know that Macron was saying something about Islam. I think after, I don't remember the name of the teacher was killed, but I'm not sure that's, but I mean, what I can say, I'm connecting from Italy, as if Catholicism wasn't in need of reform, as if Catholicism wasn't a big obstacle to, real people and real life, as if, the church didn't have influence on what the Italian parliament is, the laws that the Italian parliament is passing or is not passing, or as if, think of Christian white supremacists in the USA. So I think, religion is religion, and that's separate from what people make of religion. I'm not saying nothing revolutionary here. Asif Bayat, just to mention possibly the latest one who talked about this. But to me, saying that Islam needs reform, I mean, I don't quite understand what are you thinking exactly of? I do understand what is the communication that Macron is trying to is making here. I do understand it very well, and honestly, I don't like it because I think it's not entirely transparent and honest. Because saying that a religion needs reform is evident in itself on the one side, but on the other side is also extremely imprecise. But I mean, when it comes to France, we do have a documented history of of Islamophobia, which is quite strong, and and that's also, if you want, not empowered, but it's consolidated, if you want, by by this idea of the laïcité. So that's the I think the context which we should focus on, much more than than reforming a religion, which, however, is being reformed all the time, and especially Islam, which works Sunni Islam, sorry, which works in a very different way than more structured, hierarchically speaking, structured religions such as Christian Catholicism or even Shia Islam. So yeah, so I see what Macron is trying to do with that, declaration, but I think it's also it's very efficient as a message. I know it works, but it works because I think there's a receptive environment. I don't remember the second part of the question.
Connected to the idea, so reforming Islam, doing that, would that be then the solution to preventing radicalization?
I'm not sure about it. I don't think radicalization has a lot to do. I mean, of course, it has to do with ideology, but it's not enough. It has much more to do with with dispossession, with discrimination, with constant and sustained racism, institutional racism in particular. So I don't think that changing the world of ideas or changing ideology is enough, unless for instance, French citizens of Arab origins are granted the same employment opportunities that white French are. It's simply not enough, and it's it telling us this fairy tale that we have, Islam should be reformed, and so we get rid of dangerous ideas, is it goes very well in line, is very much in line with what I was saying before. It kind of shifts the focus. It distracts us from material conditions to and draws our attention to elements which are not, I don't think are crucial. I think are quite peripheral to this. Ideas have always been around. I mean, religious radicalism has always been around in Christianity, in Islam, in, I don't know, all the others, all the other religions, monotheist or non-monotheist. The question we have to ask ourselves is why, in specific historical context, those more radical ideas resurface and gain traction, become important, become politically salient. That's the real question, because they have always been around. So that's something that has to do with the material condition of that historical context, not with the idea itself, because the idea has always been there.
Thank you very much for very thought-provoking comment. We have another question now, already looking into the future, having had the historical trace a little bit of the movement, and we have a participant asking, what are the possible future implications for Iranian politics? Do you think that such revolutionary movement as had been there in the past would persuade the Iranian people to resort to a rebellious attitude against the state? So would people take to the streets?
So this is a very good question. Thanks for asking it. It's also very difficult though, because I don't have a crystal ball, and it's all, we can not predict. I don't predict because I wish I was able to predict, but I'm not. But we have some indications, right? And what we have seen is that there have been, let's say, since the Green Movement, well, actually slightly after the Green Movement, because the repression that followed the Green Movement was extremely violent. So a lot of people were traumatized, went in exile, went in prison, were sentenced to prisons and so forth and so on. But in the past 10 years, or 7 years, 6 years, we have had a recurring pattern of mobilization. So we have had regular protests. And there are people who, colleagues who have done very serious work on these protests, studying, the slogans, for instance, or studying, the demands, even studying the strategies. And what they say is that there's a radicalization. So it's long are the days when people took to the streets to demand reform and defend the president of the republic. Right now, slogans are much more radical. Often protests start off as motivated by economic reasons. So we've seen that. So the price of the fuel and so forth and so on, but turn political very quickly. So the slogans are against the Islamic Republic, against the regime. So there is a pattern of radicalization. This is extremely important. And also there seemed to be a pattern of cross-class coalition or cross-class presence, not coalition, because that's a step too forward. But there is a cross-class presence. However, we are also looking at a country where the kind of grassroots politics, not necessarily progressive activism, but just the way in which people, self-organize at the grassroots level is extremely fragmented. And it's fragmented. So you have a lot of very small and non-networked groups or networks, so this means that establishing a consistent and strong social movements, which is able to take to the streets, for a long time and force political change is very unlikely. And I think that, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think that when it comes to institutional politics, as Olivia mentioned, we're having presidential elections soon. I don't think that institutional politics, would be a kind of a political environment that people will look at as, okay, I want to be politically engaged in those structures. That is not the case. I think I think there's very little credibility that is given to policymakers, to politicians. So this will have implications which can be revolution, although I don't think so for the reasons I said before, but also can be just a lot of disillusioned people and disappointment and depression.
Thank you so much, Paola. I'm afraid on this note, we will have to end, but we took a glimpse into the future a little bit. We will see how things turn out. Now also we're able to put this into a little bit into the perspective of what you have told us. And I would like to thank everyone for being with us tonight, for all the questions that we have received. I wish we had more time to speak more, but hopefully there will be another occasion. And we would hope to be able to welcome you again soon, Paola. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I can't wait for coming, in person, but also thanks to you from me for the very interesting questions, comments, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about my work.
Thank you so much.